Welcome everybody. I'd like to say a few words at the start of this event here today to set the scene for this very interesting group of speakers who are lined up over the next 2 days. I'll say more about the speakers in a moment, but first let's look at the question, why are we here discussing 2025? And we're here because I think many of you share my view that quite possibly life in 2025 could be very significantly different when it is today. Not just a little bit different, but because of various trends, including the trend of technology, things will be profoundly different. And you'll hear speeches from various presenters looking at some of the technological aspects. But for a moment, let's cast our mind back, not forwards 11 years, but back 11 years to 2003. And think of some of the changes in technology we've experienced over these last 11 years. 11 years ago, there were no Kindles or hardly any e-books to speak of. There were no iPads, things we take for granted nowadays. iPads are less than 5 years old. There were just a few smartphones, but they were hardly in much use and not very widely adopted. 11 years ago, goodness, there was no YouTube. Can you remember a time when we didn't take YouTube for granted? And how much that has changed things. There was no Facebook 11 years ago, there was no Twitter, there was a tiny fledgling Wikipedia, but only a tiny amount. So that's all happened. Now you may say that's just gadgetry. It's nothing fundamental. It's just some toys or whatever. But I would say that's to underestimate what's going on here in two ways. First, as we'll hear from some of the speakers later, including Simon Bransfield-Garth, who's speaking third, this mobile technology, along with other technologies, is making a profound difference to the well-being of many people in the emerging economies, as well as in the developed economies. But secondly, we have to look ahead. And just as the last 11 years has seen more and more powerful computing technology in so many places, what we're going to see now is the computing technology getting smaller and more widespread. It'll be in our infrastructure. It won't just be the internet. It'll be the Internet of Things, and as some people have said, the internet everywhere. Not just in our phones, but in our clothing. So-called wearables is increasingly the trend you're going to hear about in the next few years. Not just glass, but also smart watch, smart clothing, smart uniforms. And moving forward again, as the technology gets smaller, implantable, which doesn't just mean jewelry for artistic sense. It means nanobots of various sorts doing more interesting things inside the body. And the second speaker this morning, Dr. Contreras from Oxford, will be talking about nanotechnology by 2025. So in short, we're going to see technology not just reprogramming our silicon, but also increasingly reprogramming our carbon, our DNA, our genetics, the software skills that have been employed in the last 11 years to make external computers better and better will increasingly be used to make our biology better and better. And not just the genetic engineering to improve synthetic life forms, but the geoengineering of various sorts to improve society. We're hearing about smart buildings, which have got more technology, and after smart buildings, you've got smart cities. Increasingly, there'll be smart societies. And the ability is there with this technology, potentially, to have an absolute abundance of energy, abundance of food, and abundance of health. That is the positive trajectory which is ahead of us. But equally, there's a second major trajectory that could be running out between now and 25, and that is much less positive a story, a scenario. And you will have some futurists who emphasize the first of these trends, but I think we also need to have the futurists looking at the second of these trends too. And paradoxically, even as we've got the technology to give us an abundance, we also are running the risk of major shortages in some of the substances that we currently, as a society, are addicted to. We're running the risk of putting severe stresses and strains on our environment, which may or may not be resulting in some of the climate issues we're seeing increasingly. And not only are there stresses and strains in the environment, there are stresses and strains in the financial systems because there's too much complexity there, there's unintended side effects happening more and more. And there's certainly big risks of what happened a few years ago in the big financial crash being repeated majorly as well. So that's what's ahead of us. There's also a strong perception of increasing inequality. Although the mean salaries are increasing, the median salaries are actually going down. An increasing sense of alienation. And I hesitate to use these words, weapons of mass destruction, because they have been misused, this phrase, but it is true that the technology can put more dangerous things into the hands of angry young men and angry middle-aged men as well, with all kinds of terrible crises. So there are these two big trajectories. Now, we might think it's all right. Our leaders are there taking care of things. Our leaders are planning and projecting ahead for 2025. Well, the reality is they're not. Politicians speak in vague terms about what might be the case in 10 years or 11 or 12 years' time, but often it's very skimpy on the details. Business leaders typically don't think very far ahead too. And so who is thinking ahead? It's not really the politician's fault, because we as a community of futurists often give very mixed messages to people. So if they start to make their policy for 10 years' time, they will say, you guys can't make up your mind. It's so scary, it's so lovely. They'll look at Hollywood projections, they'll look at all the different books that we futurists write and magazine articles we write, and it's very much a mixed bag. And so it is the mission of London Futurists to try and bring a more serious gathering together of both of these projections, the projections of what technology can enable and the projections of how we can deal with these societal crises. And you will hear speakers talk in the next 2 days about both of these trends. You'll also hear speakers about Humanity Plus or transhumanism, and we have several people from the Humanity Plus movement taking part, talking about the vision of recognizing, as the Transhumanist Manifesto says, that humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science and technology, but the Humanity Plus organization, as it says right at the start of its website, is dedicated to elevating the human condition in account, taking advantage of the technology, but also being aware of these risks. In terms of leaders, I think in this room there are many people who will play key roles in helping to clarify the important scenarios for the next 10, 11 years. I've looked at the profile of many of the people who've registered, and I'm humbled to see the depth of skills that many of you are bringing. But I think the speakers who are here will also give a fascinating mix of views. Some of them are technologists, some of them are social activists, change activists, some of them are business people, others are more professional futurists. I think there is a wide range of fascinating presentations ahead. And with that, I would like to declare this conference open. Thank you very much. So to keep the conference running smoothly, we have a couple of session moderators, and the person who will be moderating today is a colleague of mine from the mobile industry for many years, Dean Bubley, who runs an organization called Disruptive Analysis. He is deeply knowledgeable about many of the trends that are shaping society, but the reason I've got him here today is he will keep us on schedule, and we're about 5 minutes late, which is fine because that's within the budget, but we don't want to run too much later. Now let me find the next presentation and key that up. And I'll hand over to Dean, who's going to look after things. We're pitching this a bit like TED. The speakers have been asked to keep their remarks to 18, 20 minutes, and then we'll have a very quick burst of questions to clarify things. At the end of the day, we'll have a deeper dive into the live issues. So, over to you, Dean.
David, thank you very much. I'm Dean Bubley. I'm a technology analyst, but my role today is to try to keep us on track. A couple of just housekeeping things before I kick off. Fire exits are 2 here and 1 at the back of the room. Phones on silent. Twitter hashtag is anticipating 2025. If when people ask questions, please keep them concise. I am not afraid of interrupting people who start pontificating. So think about the question in advance and keep it brief. I read a couple of very profound things the other day. There's a very interesting comment that it really resonated with me, which was said, if you ever find yourself the smartest person in the room, then you're in the wrong room. I am pretty confident that I am very much in the right room today on that basis. And I'm certainly not going to say any particular words of introduction, except when it comes to sort of trying to work out what technologies or what events are going to happen in the future, there's a separate role as well as forecasting of what I'll call anti-forecasting, of trying to work out what won't happen or can't happen or will take longer. And certainly one of the things that I think is sometimes important is that we always look at predictable problems. We predict them up front and we try to head them off at the pass, rather than, as happens a lot in my area of technology, telecoms, where people ignore them and then fix them serially afterwards. They're like, well, we'll deal with that when we've got a prototype working. Oh, that's gone wrong, we'll fix it. That's gone wrong, we'll fix that next. Whereas in fact, there's a whole bunch of stuff you could have done up front to compress the end timeline. And the risk I sometimes see in bits of the industry is it takes companies, and particularly companies rather than individuals, 4 years to spot a good idea, 4 years to implement it, and then another 4 years to realise they were too late. So what I'm hoping, given our timeline of 11 years, is that we can manage to squeeze all that. And with that in mind, I'd like to now introduce our first speaker to the stage. It's Rohit Talwar, who's a global futurist and the founder of Fast Future Research. I am not going to do long intros. All of the stuff is on the website, or if you print anything out. I'm just going to give people maximum time to speak. Rohit.